Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Using Connection and Influence Mapping to Understand Organizational Risk. Your presenter today is Mark Peco. This is one in a series of webinars that we run roughly every 2 weeks throughout the year on cutting edge, innovative topics to try and bring the best that we have to you as a community so you can get some understanding of what's changing and what developments are happening in the world that we live in. Mark Peco is one of our senior instructors, senior consultant. He's got graduate and undergraduate degrees in engineering from the University of Waterloo, and he's a specialist in business intelligence and analytics, big data, analytics, data science, that kind of thing. He's a certified business intelligence professional. Sorry, that's a mouthful. At the mastery level, and his personal expertise is in analytics, information management, and team leadership. Mark, welcome to the presentation today. I hope you have a great time. Everybody, Mark is going to be running through his presentation. Please save your questions till the end. Thank you very much. Mark, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. So welcome everybody. So whatever time zone you're in, it's either good morning or good evening or good afternoon. So I hope you enjoy this. So the topic or the theme of the talk tonight is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially it boils down to how do we find things that are connected and map them into a world of risk. So we use connection and influence mapping or modeling to understand risk. And risk is at different levels. So in this case, we're going to talk about either organizational risk or in some cases just risk in general. So here's a picture of me. This is actually myself before COVID. I haven't been to a barber in a while, so this is a pre-COVID shot here. So that's who I am, and let's get started. So I want to kind of just set sort of an agenda here for where we're going to go over the next little bit of time. Is I want to describe an approach or a framework for modeling risks by using, essentially I'm going to introduce something called a graph. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But graphs are how we model, or one way to model connectivity. It's a unifying technique that can take many different techniques that have been out there for years and provide a unified way of connecting some of these ideas. So before we get into the graphs, I want to talk about some common terminology or modeling techniques or disciplines that all have approached the idea of connectivity as part of the discipline. And we're going to unify that thinking with the idea of a graph, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then I want to apply that thinking to the areas of risk modeling, because risks are really all about how different factors are connected with different things. So let's start off with some common terminology and some that comes from different disciplines. So if we think about the first one is the idea of what a system is. A system is really defined as a collection of components in a general way that are organized to accomplish a specific set of objectives. We can think of an organization as a system. We can think of as a sports team as a system. We can think of transportation flowing through a city as a system. We can think of a system that delivers information to us through social media, because it's made up of different kinds of components. Now, if we understand how these components are connected and how they're influenced by each other, we start to get a holistic view. So if we think about a system, the thing it has in common is that they all have inputs and outputs, and they have some way of transforming inputs into outputs with something we call throughput. And that's how things flow through a system. Now, systems don't live in an island or in a vacuum. They are connected to an external environment. So we tend to put boundaries around a system, like boundaries around, say, an organization, or boundaries around a traffic system or a highway system or a city. We put boundaries around it. And what's external to those boundaries is called the external environment. And external environments give us impacts, drivers, conditions, events that influence how the system will behave. And we typically give goals to our systems, and we want to monitor how our systems perform to a certain goal. And we typically take measurements as from the output side and bring it back as feedback into the input side, so we can start to adjust how we control the system to try to achieve our goal. So this is a very generic view of the term a system, and it comes from the worlds of systems thinking and system modeling. And the intent here is this is one way of thinking about how things are connected in a holistic way. But there's another concept, which is sort of related, maybe a little bit different. This is the idea of what's called a network. So a network is really interconnected components within a system. So if I said a system is the set of things we need to accomplish a goal, a network is really the under the covers view of how those things are actually connected to each other. And the connectivity could be through influence, through communications, through physical connections like highways and roads, through lines of authority in an organization, or through people who we know in a social media network. So there's different kinds of connections that connect things in a network. And networks have different kinds of structures. And that's what we're going to find out about. We can find interesting. We'll get into the idea of risk in a few minutes. Networks can be centralized, either concentrated usually at a central point, or they can be decentralized, where the components are distributed throughout their environment. Now, what this tells us is interesting is that we start to look at risk within a network, where we tend to concentrate something is a single point of failure. That becomes a risk area by itself. If we're distributed or decentralized, we don't really have a single point of failure, and if something fails, our network will probably still serve its purpose. But let's talk about networks because there's different kinds of networks depending on what we're actually trying to connect. And we're going to introduce some terminology in a minute to introduce these circles are called nodes, and the lines are called edges, and we're going to eventually call these edges relationships. But think of this as like intersections in a city connected by streets. That's one way to think about it. And we have tangible networks, which is physical infrastructure, and I'll talk about these in a second with examples. We have intangible networks, where it's really about people through influence and awareness and how we know each other through our own social relationships. And we have hybrid networks. And hybrid networks is really where people start to interact with a tangible network. So you can imagine if you're running a factory or a plant, that's all about physical or tangible components that are working together in a network. But you overlay a management layer on top of that. It could be a marketing layer. It could be a production planning layer. It could be even a recruiting and hiring layer. All of these management structures are intangible, but they connect with the tangible network, and they start to interact with each other. And that forms what we call a hybrid network. Now, just in terms of a couple of examples, these are just to kind of give perspective here. So I've talked about tangible, intangible, and hybrid networks. A tangible network is like a supply chain. It's like a city street. It's a transportation system or a telecommunications network. It's physical, or a power system. It's physical things connected to physical things, and it tends to deliver stuff to us. So one thing I want to mention as well, one of the reasons we want to understand networks is that there's a couple of reasons. One is to understand the structure and where the points of failure are, or the points of influence. But also things tend to flow through a network. So traffic flows through a transportation network, communications flows through an information network, etc. So we want to understand the flow and the capacity, and also the points of failure. And we can apply that to a physical world in the tangible side. And the intangible network is around, again, think of social media, where people know each other and they influence each other. And it could be a management structure or something like that. It's all about people influencing other people. And we have a hybrid network, as I mentioned, where we have a management layer that is overlaying on top of a physical asset layer, which starts to have a hybrid network where people are influencing physical devices. So this is the idea of different kinds of networks. And if we think about the social relationships, this is important to know how people communicate. And with the advent of social media over the last couple of decades, we think about how people are influencing each other with communications, with either personal or news, those kinds of things. The process management layer is at the hybrid level, where we have a management structure overlaying on top of physical components. And what's important from all of this is that things are connected with relationships. So things are physical or intangible. They represent things that are in the real world. And relationships are the way that they become connected. And there's different kinds of connections. We talked about, we could think of a relationship as how we could think of the things they're connecting. This could be a concept, an idea, an object, people, or just general things. They're connected, and the state of being connected is the relationship that's causing that. They could be logical or physical connections. So again, a physical road connects two cities. That's a physical connection. A logical connection might be we can communicate with FaceTime between the two cities, not have to physically go there. So those are different kinds of connections that exist, and those are the forms of relationships. But think of relationships in a general sense. We're trying to model relationships. There are dependencies where something constrains what I can do. Something has to happen first. There are associations. We say that these things tend to happen together. We think about influences. These are things that don't really cause me to do something, but they strongly change my behavior to do it because maybe advertising is like influencing me, or social media commentary is. There are direct forces that really cause things to happen. So a direct force forces the behavior, it doesn't just influence it. And the relationships are also contextual because these networks live in the real world, and other things connect from the outside of their network into the network to influence it. Now, relationships have different properties. Think of the direction of a relationship. It could be non-directional, where it doesn't matter the direction. And an example of that could be that Bob knows Mary, or that Bob and Mary are married, or Sam and Dave are friends. That's just a state they're in. It's an existence of a state. It doesn't mean that there's influence over that relationship. It simply means they're both connected through something in common called maybe a marital status or a friendship status. But other relationships are directional. And we have to, once we understand the direction, that helps us understand the flow of things. So directional relationships, well, an example could be, the traffic flow on a city. That maybe it's a one-way street. You can only drive one way on a street. It could be directional, could be a reporting hierarchy in a company where I report up to my boss. My boss doesn't report down to me. So it's a directional flow in terms of authority. So think of relationships as defining a couple of things. They define paths or path segments and groups. Now, what does that mean? When we talk about flow through a network, when we get into the risk world in a few minutes, things tend to flow to either cause a bad or good outcome. So they tend to flow through a path. And if we understand the path, we can influence that path by mitigating things or putting in other kinds of forces to mitigate the flow. So first of all, we have to understand where things flow. And again, in the physical world, that's pretty obvious to us. It's the flow of traffic through streets, or the flow of communications through a telecom network. And paths also help us to isolate and segment different sort of subgroups within a network. So if you imagine the culture in a company, we tend to think about people, we think of people working in silos in departments, but there's also informal networks where there's friendships, there's camaraderie, there's people that socialize, and the informal networks are where communications happen, and sometimes there's very influential people in those groups or those segments. And by understanding the flow of communications, it helps us understand who the dominant figure is in terms of getting their attention to make a decision. It may not be showing on the org chart, but it simply shows that the significant person can be identified by isolating them in a network. And so these are simply examples of how relationships can be used to talk about flow, talk about connections, and the third thing is around capacity. Networks have capacity to move a certain amount of commodity through the network. And if we have to expand the network's capacity for whatever reason, if it's a physical network or even if it's an organizational network, if we have to expand it, we have to say, well, where do I best add new capacity? If I have to add people to a workflow to increase their processing ability, I need to know where are my capacity constrained and where do I add incremental capacity to best move the flow of commodity through the network. So that's where relationships become very handy for us. They're not just to connect things, they're to help us understand how the network will actually behave and make things flow through it. I mentioned that dependencies are a certain type of relationship. They're a specific class or type of relationship, and these are very important to us because dependencies start to define constraints, that we can't exceed certain things, or things have to be done in a certain sequence. We can't do something until some other activity is finished. And they also establish pre-existing conditions for us, something we live, maybe they're sometimes called boundary conditions, things that exist out of our control. So we're dependent on the environment sometimes to give us that information. And we also have statistical dependencies. Now, by this, I really mean things like correlations. So correlations don't by any means tell me something is a causal relationship, but they simply identify strong dependencies between things. So if we understand that the behavior of things are dependent on each other because of a correlation that I've discovered through statistics, I can use that to my advantage if I want to influence the behavior of the network. So where all of this is going is trying to connect the dots. So I've talked about systems and I've talked about networks. And I want to unify the discussion now through discussing graphs, because a graph, we think, if we haven't been trained in this area, we think of a graph as like a bar chart or a line graph. That's another use of the word graph. But in this context, a graph is from the world of mathematics, and it's really how we model networks. And so a representation of a network is called a graph. And that's what I want to talk about now for the next few minutes, because this becomes the basis for introducing this into the world of understanding risk. So even though we've seen a picture like this, we called it a network earlier, well, think of a network as something that's physical out there, but the representation or the model of that network we're going to call a graph. And think of this as a simplification or a model of the network. And the idea of the building blocks here, I talked about the definitions earlier, that the circle's shape is really called a node, and those represent the things in my area of interest. And the lines or the relationships that connect the nodes are technically called edges in the world of graphs. But in the world of data, in the world of something more applied to us in the world of business, we tend to relax that term and call them relationships, because an edge is simply a type of a relationship. And we sometimes call them links. So whether you call it a link like a street or an edge or the relationship between intersections, they all mean the same thing. But the graph gives me structure about the network so I can analyze it, and it helps me understand the performance of the network. So performance might be around things like, how long does it take to travel across the network? What's my travel time? What's the shortest route between 2 points? What's the least cost between 2 points? What's the most reliable flow? Which is the least reliable flow? Which point tends to fail? Where are my capacity constraints? Do I have to add more relationships or links to get more capacity between nodes? So when you start to understand the kinds of networks these represent, there's lots of analysis and decision making we can make to make our network A, more robust, and B, more capacity, and C, optimize the flow of cost through it. And it depends on the problem you're trying to solve, because all of these are not applied all the time, but they give us the basis to do those kinds of analyses. And so to further kind of give you some examples, and I used this earlier, when we get in, we start talking about graphs, and we're going to talk briefly about a graph database and graph analytics in a few minutes with risk. The intent here is to understand that at a simple level, I talked about the direction of relationships. And here's the examples. In the world of graphs in a database, every relationship is either one directional or no direction. And so if we have multiple relationships, like in the middle case here, that Bob watches Netflix and Netflix is watched by Bob, those are two different relationships with two separate one-directional links or relationships. That's called a directed graph, because the relationships have direction. In the first example, Fred advises Carl, so the influence there is through advice, and it's a directed graph because it points who's giving advice to who. Now, the bottom one is that these two people are married, so there isn't a direction here. If we believe in the state of equality, then this is a state we're both in. So it's representing this undirected, and there isn't a point of influence in either direction. So this idea of direction and non-direction is important. We start to model the flow of things through the graph that we can apply in a risk context in a couple of minutes. But something else we can start to add is something called properties. Because if we want to analyze things like risk or flows or capacity or cost or time, we need data to do that. So the example here is that there's different kinds of graphs that exist in the world today in terms of research and in terms of business and commercial applications. We're talking here about a property graph. A property graph is as I defined with the nodes and the relationships. But what's interesting about this is we start to add properties to the nodes and relationships. And those properties are identified with some sort of a mnemonic or a key or a label or some sort of a term with a value. So in the case of Mary, she has two properties. We know her occupation, we know her income. And Mary is a noun, she's a node. George is also a noun and a node. We see his income and his occupation. Likewise, the restaurant they like to dine at is Ray's Pizza. It also is a node. It's something that physically exists. And we can see some properties about the pizza, when it opened, and a couple of other items there. But that's okay. That's good. We expect that to have properties with the nodes. But what's really interesting, and this is really differentiates it from traditional kinds of databases that I'm going to talk about very briefly at the end, is that we can put properties on the relationships as well. If you're familiar with relational databases, that's something we really can't do. In the relational database world, we tend to have, we would call Mary and George and Ray's Pizza as either entities or maybe rows in an entity or a table. And how they're related will be through mapping keys. And I'd simply say that Mary maybe is somehow related to Ray's Pizza by there's a key mapping. And that's all we do is just a key. But with graphs, we can actually put data properties on the relationship, which is very powerful because now we can analyze things about the relationship in terms of its force, its strength, its capacity, how forceful it is, when things started, putting dates on it, etc. So the point is, we start to model in a graph world, the relationships and the nodes are equal when it comes to having data properties around them. And that's a really powerful concept when we start to think about how to better model risk is treating it as a graph with properties, because I'm not going to go into the detail of this next topic, but there are many algorithms out there that are available to help us analyze things about the graph based on the properties we've defined for it. So things like least cost, as I said earlier, the weak link in the chain, the most influential node, clustering of common communities, if you like. These are all things that algorithms can run against because the properties are there to support the algorithms. So I'm just going to kind of leave that as the way to think about a property graph that we can move forward on. But the point of all this is say, well, so what? Like, why are graphs important? It's interesting that graphs, I believe, are starting to really come into their own in terms of going mainstream. For many years, I mean, they've had their root in mathematics. They've been around for many decades. They're not new, but they haven't really become a mainstream topic. And I think it's partly because we've been influenced by how we've stored data in the past with relational databases. And because computers are so cheap, the cloud is there, memory is so cheap, processing's cheap, that graphs might take more memory and processing power, but they pay off because you can do more things with them. So they provide a unifying approach to look at the things we've introduced already. We talked about systems as a series of components connected together to accomplish a goal. We talked about networks as a bunch of things connected called nodes, either in a tangible or intangible sense, and how they're connected so things can flow through them. We talked about relationships as the dependencies, the influence points, the forces, those kinds of things. And we talked about dependencies as constraints and other things that are there. All of these are really important when we start to talk about risk. And the kinds of things that we can answer, if you're sitting back as an analyst or as a manager, and you want to say, I've modeled my world through a graph lens, if you like, what are some of the kind of questions I could answer? Because I think about now network performance, network failure, network structure, network optimization, however we've modeled it. So the question is, how are things actually structured here? How does communications actually flow through my company? If I could monitor the emails sending out, are they really siloed and sticking in one department, or are my emails distributed equally across where my informal networks are? How do things flow? We think about traffic flow, we're going to talk about an accident as a risk in a few minutes. But in many cases, when there's an accident on a major thoroughfare, that traffic tends to reroute itself. Sometimes there's now smartphone apps and our GPSs to guide us. What's the best route to take when the route I'm on is no longer a good thing to do? So how do things flow is looking for alternatives through a network, and what causes the flows to be influenced or to be, to get the best performing. Another question is, if you think about the nodes themselves, we talk about dominance or influence. Who are the dominant nodes? Who are the people that have the most sway in your company in terms of making an opinion or making a decision? It may not be the person that's most senior, as I mentioned on the org chart, but it's a person maybe who has the most credibility or speaks the loudest. Maybe it's the loudest voice in the room thing. But the point is, if we can monitor the number of people a person knows within a company, and we can model the number of relationships they have, we start to understand, where the dominance comes from versus people who have less contacts. And we can start to use algorithms to point them out to us to say, these are the influential nodes, these are the dominant nodes, and that's really important if we're going to look at performance, especially at a social network level. But at a physical level, and I guess even at a social level, where are the single points of failure, or are there any? So we think about in a city where there's a river, and we only have one bridge that crosses the river, all traffic has to go across the one bridge. So if the bridge is out of commission for whatever reason, traffic can no longer cross the bridge. So that's a single point of failure. And many of our physical networks are like that. We have many things where it may not be a single point of failure, but there's very few points of failure that if something happens, then it causes all kinds of congestion elsewhere. And that's also true in an organization. What if a key influential person leaves the company? What happens to customer service if the best salesperson leaves? What happens to an organization if a great innovative person has left? These are points of failure organizationally. And those are questions I can start to answer if I can model the data properly. What is the cost and time for the things that flow? So I said flow could be information, communications, influence. It could be traffic. It could be power. It could be fluids in a water system. So all of these things tend to flow through the network, and we want to find out what is the cost and time of flows if I have choices to get across town in the city network. Maybe it's not always the least time, maybe it's a low cost. Maybe I want to consider taking the 407 and paying a toll in Toronto, and maybe it gets me there faster, but it gives me an extra amount of money I have to pay. So I want to understand least cost and least time and make an informed choice through the tolls or the extra cost for traversing a certain part of a network. When you get into capacity, everything is constrained. We know that when we drive in traffic, at least in the pre-COVID times anyways, we think about capacity as what constrains how much can flow somewhere. And that causes congestion, which is obviously big delays and big costs. And those don't have to simply be in the physical world. It could be that I have to have a person who has to approve an invoice, and it's backed up because I don't have enough capacity to approve invoices, and I can't get them out, and therefore my cash flow suffers. So capacity in any kind of a network is important, whether it's human or physical. Now the question is, how do you increase capacity? And there's all kinds of algorithms and techniques out there. If I want to increase capacity of, say, of a call center or of a sales team, how many people do I add and at what skill level? So how I have to pay people more money if they're at a higher skill level. So how do I add the right kind of capacity to my network to make sure that I'm getting the performance I want? So again, to analyze capacity, the cost of increasing it, and where to increase it to maximize the flow through it is very interesting to me as a manager. And finally, overall, how does the network perform? And performance is a pretty broad term, but we need to have specific objectives for what we want to achieve with our network. It could be around cost, reliability, resilience, time, maybe customer satisfaction is influenced by this, etc. So the whole idea of network performance, again, whether it's a physical or intangible networks, are really important to understand where the congestion points are, where the cost points are. And the theme of our talk tonight is, where are the high points of risk? And that's what we're going to get into very shortly here, is is we need to understand the risk points so we can take mitigating factors to keep things operating the way we want to. So just a short commentary on technology, and it's all I'm going to do is just a short commentary because this is not a technical talk, is the idea of a graph database versus and also comes along with what are called graph algorithms. So there are many open source and freeware graph databases out there. I tend to use something called Neo4j. It's free for a personal level, so you can download it and play with it yourself for free. So Neo4j is a company that's been around for about, I don't know, maybe over a dozen years, but they're really becoming more mainstream today with their products. They help us store property graphs, as I mentioned, which is nodes and relationships with the properties that are important to us to analyze performance. But with that comes, and especially with Neo4j, the one I'm familiar with, comes a whole library of graph algorithms, which you can call to actually determine things like where's the point of failure of my network? Where's the most influential point? What's the least cost through the network? What's the least amount of time? Where's the most influential nodes? How do I segment my my network into communities of interest or common themes? So these are algorithms that help us do some of the more interesting things to take advantage of the properties of with my graph. So we're going to apply this to the world of risk over the next couple of minutes, and then I'm going to close off at the end of that with just a screenshot of a graph I built showing how this risk framework can actually be modeled. So let's talk about risk now for a few minutes, and then we're going to kind of come into the final part of our discussion. So we have to sit back, and there's many kind of discussion points. Well, what risk actually means? You know, people say, "Oh, risk is a bad thing. Risk means bad." Not necessarily. The true definition of risk is that it measures uncertainty. It could be uncertainty for a good event or a bad event happening. So don't think that the risk always implies that something bad going to happen. In our example, it is going to be a bad thing happening, but it could also be a good thing happening. So we think about the risk exposure is the amount of money we have to pay if something bad actually happened. So we think about this as the exposure is an event happening or the impact of that event times, so really it's the impact of the event. So suppose the event we're going to talk about is a car accident in a minute. So what is the dollar value impact of a car accident? Well, that's, maybe we put dollars to it. And that's what we have to pay if the event happens. But then the risk exposure is the probability of that event times the dollar exposure. So really it's that product that tells us our risk exposure. So really we have two things we can play with here. We can play with the probability and change it, or we can change with the impact of the event and change it. And that's going to be the basis of our discussion. We'll get into risk modeling in a second. So uncertainty of the impact is if it does happen, what's the consequence of the results? How much are we exposed if the bad event does happen? So when we talk about risk mitigation, we can think about playing with those two variables, as I mentioned. We want to really reduce the risk exposure. And the two variables I can play with is the likelihood of the event happening and the consequences or impact if the event does eventually happen. And both of those, and that's why we buy insurance, because we want to reduce the impact, our liability, if that's what the insurance industry is all about, is understanding the impact of an event and covering with your policy to pay for that. But we also want to reduce the likelihood of a bad event by different mitigation techniques that we'll talk about in a second here. So think of these as two variables I want to play with, but before I can know how to play with them, I need to model them and see how are they connected. Which of the areas I should focus on to mitigate my risk exposure. So the things that cause an event, it's rarely going to be one factor causing it. So the point here is that there's many factors that sometimes have to add up together to make the event actually happen. And so we have to understand the connectivity between different kinds of events and how they influence each other to lead up to the event we're trying to actually understand. So events or conditions are the things that happen that lead to a specific outcome. Now, they contribute to and trigger a specific outcome based on different kinds of relationships. So think of relationships here as it could be causal. So if I press my accelerator of my car, I go faster. That's a causal relationship. I put on the brake pedal, I slow down. That's a causal relationship. The influential kind of relationships are things like, the impact of advertising or commercials or different kinds of slogans or influential from my peers or my colleagues or social media. That influences my behavior. I guess in connection. So we think about we're going to have a car accident in a minute. We think about a human is connected to the car. So we think about the human as a driver, as a node, and the automobile is another node with are being influenced by the driver. So in general, the specific outcomes, as I said, don't be always negative. The events we want could actually be positive. So risk factors could lead to a desirable effect where I get to my meeting on time. What's the likelihood of being on time if I take certain chances? The undesirable effect of maybe speeding might be getting into an accident or getting a speeding ticket. So there's different kinds of consequences for the actions we take. But we generally think that risk measures a negative result. It's not true, but we tend to think about that. The reality is risk is a measurement of the uncertainty of any type of an outcome. But again, as I mentioned, we tend to think about it from a negative point of view, and that's just because we're usually about insurance and those kinds of things. So we talked about risk factors, things like pressing my accelerator, going too fast. Maybe I don't take safety measures. I don't obey stop signs. I run through red lights. That could be a reckless driver. Those are all factors that could lead up to a bad event, like an accident. But if we think about mitigation factors, how do we reduce either the impact of that event happening, the consequence of the event, or the probability of the event happening? So think about the conditions that lead to the reduction in the probability of the event or the reduction of the impact of the event on the final outcome. So it goes back to the two variables, the probability of the event and the impact of the event. Mitigation can be applied to both of those, either one or the other or both. The thing we also have to recognize is that the mitigation factors here are things under our control. These are things as a person or as a management team we have control over because we can actually adjust things under our control. We can apply these mitigation factors. However, the risk factors are not under our control. They're things that are happening despite our best intents. They're out of our control. And we're trying to apply our mitigation factors to reduce the likelihood of those bad things happening and the combination of factors adding up to cause it to happen. But we can't control them, we can simply mitigate their effect. So we've talked about the building blocks of risk, and I'm just trying to show it here in really simple terms that the things that come in are the events or the conditions that are going to cause something, say some kind of an outcome. There is the mitigating the impact. In other words, how do we reduce the impact of the bad event happening? There is also mitigating the probability of the event. So not just the event's impact, but its likelihood to happen. So the probability of the event is there, the risk factors are there. We want to mitigate both of those things, the impact of the factor and the probability of it happening. And that should all be there to reduce the risk exposure that we're trying to contain. So now we're going to get into more of a risk perspective. And there's a couple more things I want to talk about here to take these ideas and apply it to what's called the BOWTIE risk model. So this is not my model, this is industry standard. Especially in the chemical process industries, it's very common for doing hazard analysis in chemical plants or utilities or those kinds of things. But if it looks like a bow tie, that's where it gets its name from. But it's covering. I want to go through a bow tie example here with generically apply it to a car accident, and then to talk about a graph that can model it for us. So this is showing the building blocks of what we talked about. The event in the center here is the event that may or may not happen. So that event It could be in a business risk case, it could be the loss of a customer. It could be the loss of a sale. It could be something bad like a fire in our plant, or it could be something that's lost, or a good employee leaves. These are all bad events that happens to as we're trying to minimize. And so on the left are the conditions that are going to contribute to that bad event. So what would cause a customer to leave you? And we say, okay, well, if we start delivering late, we start raising our prices too high, or if our product quality is not very good, then those causes on the left may add up to the fact that my bad event, my hazardous event, is that my customer says, thank you, I'm leaving to the competition. Now, so that's the event. Now, what are the consequences of the event? That's really on the right. So every event has either one or many consequences or results or impacts. So what we think about a hazardous event as if we lost our customer, it could be a consequence is I have to spend a lot more money to find a new customer. So it could be a cash drain. It could be a loss of, it could have a domino effect where I'm going to lose more customers because word of mouth spreads. It could be a revenue crunch. It could be a reputation risk, or reputation consequence. So all of these consequences are going to cost me money. Now, the things in the middle, these little black little rectangular shapes or circular shapes, are things we can put up to mitigate either side of this. So on the left, we have what are called control barriers. And control barriers are things that I can make, I can mitigate the likelihood of that cause actually making that event happening. So we're trying to reduce the probability of that event or that cause linking to the event. So it could be something around, I offer a deal to the customer, or I try to offer them a cash rebate for something that went wrong, or something that I want to reduce, or I spend effort, more time to increase the quality of my product. So I try to tell them that a better product quality is coming, please be patient. So these are all things I can put up to mitigate the probability of the cause causing that event. But on the right side are things I can put up to mitigate the consequence of the event. So if it's a loss of revenue, or it's extra cost to find a new customer, or reputation risk, or reputation consequence, what can I put in place to mitigate that impact? So it could be that by definition, I've diversified my customer base in the first place, and I have more customers, and I have a lot of customers in the pipeline. It could be something around having a marketing campaign to fight the consequences of a reputation event that happened. So these are all potential areas that I can play with. So I have controls on the left to reduce the probability. I have controls on the right to minimize the consequence. And the point of all this is how would I turn this into analyze? Because this is simply a picture. So how could I actually analyze this and make decisions around that? That's what I want to show you an example to do that. So here's an example. I've simply taken a generic view, and I've added this now to a traffic accident. And I've put in different sources of conditions that could lead to an accident. So I said icy roads. It's really low windshield fluid in my car, so I can't clean my windshield. Or it could be I have the wrong tires in my car. So it's possible that I could attribute a traffic accident in the wintertime to any three of these things that maybe add up together, that they all contribute to the traffic accident. And on the right is the consequence of the traffic accident. It could be injury, it could be even a fatality. It could be the cost of paying for a tow truck. It could be financial liability, that I have to pay higher insurance premiums later, or I have to pay for somebody else's damages or something. I'm not insured properly. So those are the consequences of the accident. And I want to find out how can I intercede here to reduce the likelihood of the accident, or if it does happen, to mitigate the impact of the accident. So on the left, the mitigating of the probabilities, I've got some examples here. I can make sure my municipality has a road salting program, so they salt the roads. Another thing, for the windshield washer fluid, I could check the fluid level before I start my trip and have a spare container in my trunk, so I can mitigate that impact. If the tires are wrong, I could have make sure I always change it, have my winter and snow and ice tires on. So these are simple things I can put in place to mitigate the impact or the likelihood of those things having a consequence of an accident. But if the accident happens, how can I mitigate its impact? Well, the car industry does that for us by they put in seatbelts for us to use and airbags. So those are to mitigate the injury or fatality result of the accident. To mitigate the impact of a tow truck cost, I could belong to the Motor League and have my towing paid for. And to mitigate my financial liability, I could have the appropriate level of insurance. So those three things are all mitigating efforts I can put in place so that I can mitigate the impact or consequence of the accident. So all of this discussion is to try to say, okay, but how do I go about actually analyzing this? Because these are simply words on a slide. So if I start to model this as a graph, and I said a graph is simply a way to connect diagrams, processes, things that are connected, things that flow. This is a way to look at nodes in my graph that are all around that event. So the event here is the accident. There's different causal factors that lead to the accident. And if the event does happen, there are certain impacts that are produced. And there's certain mechanisms I can put in place to minimize the probability of the cause and minimize the impact if it does happen, so minimize my impact. So I have a defense node, I have a control node, and I have the cause and impact nodes with the event node. So when this is done at a graph level, we think of these as a high-level grouping of things. So this is called, every circle here is called a node type. And under each node type, there could be many nodes. We get many causes, many controls, many defenses, many impacts. So this is simply a starting point to say, how could I think about that bow tie model, which could be used to organizational risk or other kinds of risk, and how can I model that in a way that I can analyze something to make a decision? So if I go back, if I think now applies to organizational risk versus a car accident, we can think about, suppose we have a supply shortage, we have inventory problems. And the things that might affect this is there's been some traffic delays, maybe a bridge is out, we can't get the goods into our warehouse. We have inventory shortages because we're out of balance with our sales. Maybe we have contractual, we don't have the right contracts in place to incentivize our suppliers to get things in on time. So the mitigation factors here to get alternate routes, increase your stock levels and inventory, which may have another consequence, or incentivize your suppliers with bonuses or other incentives to make sure they're never going to run short, so that you can always make sure you have enough supply on hand. So those are simply ideas to mitigate the likelihood of the bad things happening. On the right side is what is the consequence of the supply shortage? Suppose it does happen. Now you got customers to deal with. So the consequence could be, again, a lost customer because you can't make the products they need because the supply is not there. So you could also, again, suffer reputation loss or revenue loss. So some ideas to defend against that is to have proactive communications, to know before it happens and engage with the customer, to offer other kinds of incentives, to recognize that they're working hard and maybe there's some sort of a discount you can apply there. Alternate suppliers, contracting, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe that one supplier is a single point of failure and you find other points of supply. And also having insurance in place to protect yourself from a supply loss. So these are simply ideas to put this at an organizational risk level to look at the causes, the consequences, and the defenses we can put in place to minimize their result. So I have one more thing to show you, which is putting this into an actual graph. So if we finally look at the accident graph is showing this model, the Neo4j, and the nodes are represented from the bow tie model, and the different node types are color coded. So there's one blue node, which is the event or the hazardous event. The red nodes are the forces that are causing the event. The green nodes are the consequences of the event, and the outer orange nodes are the mitigating factors, and the pinkish nodes are the reducing the consequence. So I simply wanted to show that if this is represented as a graph, it opens the possibility to put in properties and data so we can apply the algorithms I was talking about, so we can start to find out where should I invest my time to mitigate the consequence appropriately. So I'm not trying to show the algorithms here. I simply wanted to show that all of that discussion can add up to a graph, and we can put it into a graph database, and we can start to analyze it with the properties. That topic would be beyond the scope of tonight, and that would be something for a later discussion point. So just as a review, we described an approach for modeling risks by using graphs as a unifying technique to look at all the different ways that we model connectivity and influence in our world. We've introduced some common terminology and how they can be distilled and summarized by using graphs. And the power of graphs is that we can now put this into a quantitative form, which is at a data and algorithm level to start to optimize our risk network. And we talked about applications of this to risk modeling. So to conclude, I'd like to thank you for monitoring or watching the webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if it's also going to be available, it's also available on YouTube. So please look for there in a couple of days. And here's my email if you want to have any questions or say hello or any comments about the webinar. I'd always appreciate the feedback. So thank you for attending. And if there's any questions now, I'll try to field them. And if there aren't, then we're going to wind it up and say goodnight.